This vignette about Clarence Day is from the podcast All Bones Considered, Laurel Hill Stories number 66, Pushing Water, Laurel Hill and Hydraulics, which you can find wherever you listen to podcasts. While globally, the Atlantic Ocean is east of the isthmus and the Pacific is west, the general direction of the canal passage from the Atlantic to the Pacific is from northwest to southeast because of the shape of the isthmus at the point the canal occupies. The Bridge of the Americas, the Puente de las Americas, at the Pacific side is about 1/3 of a degree east of the Colon end on the Atlantic side. Still, in formal nautical communications, the simplified directions southbound and northbound are used. The canal consists of artificial lakes, several improved and artificial channels, and 3 sets of locks. An additional artificial lake, Alajuela Lake, known during the American era as Madden Lake, acts as a reservoir for the canal. The layout of the canal, as seen by a ship passing from the Atlantic to the Pacific, is as follows. From the formal marking line of the Atlantic entrance, you enter Limon Bay, Bahia Limon, a large natural harbor. The entrance runs 8.9 kilometers, about 5.5 miles. It provides a deep-water port, Cristobal, with facilities like multimodal cargo exchange to and from a train and the Colon Free Trade Zone, which is a free port. A 3.2-kilometer, 2-mile channel forms the approach to the locks from the Atlantic side. The Gatun Locks, G-A-T-U-N, a 3-stage flight of locks 2 kilometers long, that's about 1.25 miles. It lifts the ships to the Gatun lake level some 27 meters above sea level, 87 feet above sea level. Gatun Lake, an artificial lake formed by the building of the Gatun Dam, carries vessels 24 kilometers across the isthmus, 15 miles. Created in 1913 by damming the Chagres River, the Gatun Lake provides the millions of liters of water necessary to operate its locks each time a ship passes through. At the time it was formed, the Gatun Lake was the largest human-made lake in the world. From the lake, the Chagres River, a natural waterway enhanced by the damming of Gatun Lake, runs about 8.4 kilometers, 5.25 miles. Here, the upper Chagres River feeds the high-level canal stretch. The Culebra Cut slices 12.5 kilometers, 7.75 miles through the mountain ridge, crosses the Continental Divide, and passes under the Centennial Bridge. The single-stage Pedro Miguel Lock, 1.4 kilometers long, less than a mile. The first part of the descent with a lift of 9.4 meters, that's 31 feet. The artificial Miraflores Lake is 1.8 kilometers long, 1.125 miles, 16 meters, or 54 feet above sea level. The 2-stage Miraflores Locks is 1.8 kilometers long, 1.125 mile. There's a total descent of 16 meters at mid-tide. And from the Miraflores Locks you reach Balboa Harbor, again with multimodal exchange provision, and where the railway meets the shipping route again. Nearby is Panama City. From this harbor, there's an entrance-exit channel that leads to the Pacific Ocean, the Gulf of Panama, 13.3 kilometers, 8.25 miles from the Miraflores Locks, passes under the Bridge of the Americas. Thus, the total length of the canal is 80 kilometers, 50 miles. In 2017, it took ships an average of 11.4 hours to pass between the canal's 2 outer locks. The most complicated section of this otherworldly construction project was the Culebra Locks, located high in the mountains in the middle of the isthmus. This section was entrusted to the Philadelphia engineering firm of Day and Zimmerman, a company founded in 1901 by Charles Day and Kern Dodge. They initially specialized in engineering, shop equipment, and management, but the organization grew to include a great deal of construction work in both the industrial and public service fields. For example, 1914, this is the company that was contracted by the Hershey Chocolate Company to produce the foil wrapping machinery for Hershey's Kisses. I talked about Hershey's Kisses and Wilbur Buds in Biographical Bites from Bala number 34. In 1907, another former classmate, John Zimmerman, joined the firm as a partner. They renamed the firm Dodge, Day and Zimmerman. But Kern Dodge withdrew as a partner in 1911. The firm now was Day and Zimmerman. The construction of the Gatun Lock began with the first concrete laid at Gatun on 24 August 1909 by Day and Zimmerman. Charles Day, 1879 to 1931, was born in Germantown. He was a son of Charles A. Day and Frances Corson Day. He attended Germantown Academy, and he met his future business partner Kern Dodge, son of James Mapes Dodge, grandson of Mary Mapes Dodge, the woman who wrote Hans Brinker or The Silver Skates. After graduation, Day entered the University of Pennsylvania. He received his B.S. in 1899 in electrical engineering, followed by his Master's of Engineering in 1901. Day was made superintendent of installation of power plant equipment and transmission machinery at the 1899 Philadelphia Export Exposition. James Mapes Dodge served on the exhibition committee. At its close in November 1899, Day entered the employ of Link Belt Engineering Company in Nicetown, Tioga. Dodge was president. Day started out as an assistant to superintendent and became engineer of works. He worked on modernizing the plant. Dodge himself was one of the promoters of Frederick Winslow Taylor's scientific management principles, and Day would follow in those footsteps. 1 decade later, a 1911 article in the American Magazine would present Day as one of a dozen frontmen of scientific management. Frederick Winslow Taylor, whom I have mentioned many times, is interred at Laurel Hill West in the river section. Kern Dodge was cremated at Laurel Hill West, but the location of his ashes is unknown. The firm Day and Zimmerman is still in existence today. The Gatun locks are built into a cut made in a hill bordering the lake. It required the excavation of 5 million cubic yards of material, mostly rock. The locks themselves were made by 2,046,100 cubic yards of concrete. The quantity of material needed to construct the locks required extensive measures to be put into place to handle the stone and cement. Stone was brought from Portobello to the Gatun locks. The work on the Pacific side actually used stone that was quarried from Ancon Hill. Huge overhead cableways were constructed in the mountains to transport concrete into the construction at Gatun. 4 85-foot towers were built on the banks of the canal. 2.5-inch steel cable was strung between them to span the locks. Buckets ran on these cables. The buckets carried up to 6 tons of concrete at a time into the locks. Electric railways were constructed to take stone, sand, and cement from the docks to the concrete mixing machines, from where another electric railway carried 2 6-ton buckets at a time to the cableways. The scale of this work is hard to imagine. No structure in the world contained this much material. To this date, the largest amount of concrete ever poured in a day anywhere had been about 1,700 cubic yards. At Gatun, the daily average was double that. The resulting lock and dam system contained more than 2 million cubic yards of concrete, enough to build a solid wall 8 feet thick, 12 feet high, and 133 miles long, the distance from Pittsburgh to Cleveland. The 6 pairs of lock chambers had the same dimensions, 110 feet wide, 1,000 feet long. The floors, solid concrete, anywhere from 13 to 20 feet thick. All the locks were constructed in 36-foot sections. Each was a single monolith that took about a week to build to full height. In all, about 5 million sacks and barrels of cement were shipped to Panama from New York. The whole concept of making the locks and canals work was dependent on having enough water, which would lift and lower the ships. The gates, at least twice as heavy as any gates ever built, actually became buoyant in the water. The power of falling water at the Gaeton spillway generated electricity to run all the motors to run the system. In other words, the canal was designed to supply its own energy needs through the power of moving and falling water. To lift a great merchant liner or any ship of more than 600 feet, to be fair, less than 5% of ships extant at the start of the 20th century were more than 600 feet. But let's say one wandered into the canal. To move it up to the level of the Gaeton Lake took 26 million gallons of water. That's the equivalent of a day's water supply for a major city like Philadelphia. For a complete lockage through the canal for one ocean-to-ocean transit, the expenditure would be double that. All of it, fresh water, washed out to sea, more than 50 million gallons for every large ship. The Pacific side locks were finished first. The single flight at Pedro Miguel in 1911 and Miraflores in May 1913. The seagoing tug Gaeton, an Atlantic entrance working tug used for hauling barges, made the first trial lockage of Gaeton locks on 26 September 1913. The lockage went perfectly, although all valves were controlled manually since the central control board was not yet ready. The first official ocean-going ship to go through the canal was a cement boat, the Cristobal, with a grand opening on 15 August 1914. If you're a history buff, you are chuckling to yourself right now because you know the next day, Sunday, August 16th, the Philadelphia Inquirer's above-the-fold headline was Allies and Germans making final preparations for a big battle. Page 4 announced Panama Canal opened to the commerces of the world. Charles Day continued to develop his career in engineering. He became a trustee at the University of Pennsylvania and Fidelity Philadelphia Company. During the Great War, he was a member of the civilian board appointed to inspect Navy yards. He served as consultant engineer to Colonel House, President Wilson's right-hand man. He was a clubman. He belonged to the Rittenhouse, Racket, Engineers, University, Philadelphia Cricket, and the Bay Head Yacht Club. His younger brother, Richard Folk Day, was an Army pilot. He was killed in action at Clermont-Ferrand on 25 September 1918, and he's buried at the Ain Marne American Cemetery. In 1931, Clarence spent 2 months in northern Africa and became ill shortly after he got back home. At the beginning of May, he was admitted to the University Hospital, and he died there on 10 May 1931. He had been living at his home at McCallum and St. George's Lane for many years. That means he was a close neighbor to Violet Oakley and the other Red Rose girls at their studio home, Cogsley, which was also on St. George's Lane. Clarence was survived by his widow, the former Margaret Dunning, and by 2 sons and a daughter. He was buried in the Marlborough section at Laurel Hill West. In that same plot, you can see a cenotaph for his brother, who was killed in action. You have been listening to an excerpt from the podcast All Bones Considered, Laurel Hill Stories number 66, Pushing Water, Laurel Hill and Hydraulics. It is one of hundreds of vignettes and full podcasts to be found among the stones at Laurel Hill East and Laurel Hill West. All Bones Considered, Laurel Hill Stories, and Biographical Bites from Bala, Laurel Hill West Stories, are available for free wherever you listen to podcasts. To contact me, Joe Lex, my email is jrlexjr1947 @gmail.com.